At 24, Nora Hale discovered that according to the state of Pennsylvania, the document proving where she had been born simply did not exist. She was already struggling to move beyond a low-paying nursing assistant job when a better hospital position required a certified birth certificate. Nora submitted the date and birthplace her mother had given her all her life, expecting an ordinary piece of paper in return. Instead, the search came back with no matching birth registration. Her mother, Elaine, had been dead for 5 years, leaving Nora with no one to ask why. Desperate for anything that might explain her past, Nora opened the box of belongings she had avoided since the funeral and found one damaged photograph of Elaine holding her as a baby outside a stone house Nora had never seen. On the back were only 3 faded words: Bellwether, October 1974. There was no address, no explanation, and no family name Nora recognized. With money already tight, spending $50 to restore an old photograph seemed ridiculous. Even people around her would have called it foolish to spend that much chasing a clue left by someone who could no longer answer questions. But Nora paid the $50 anyway. When the photograph was cleaned and enlarged, something appeared in the background that had been almost invisible for 24 years. A name carved into a stone gatepost: Bellwether. That single word led Nora to an aging estate outside a small Pennsylvania town, where the elderly owner had recently died and her property was already caught in probate. Nora insisted she was not looking for an inheritance. She wanted to know why her mother had brought her there as an infant, and why there was no ordinary birth certificate documenting who she was. Then she walked into Bellwether Estate and saw something that stopped her cold. Hanging on the wall was an old portrait of a young woman painted decades before Nora was born. The woman was 24 when the portrait was made, the same age Nora was now, and when Nora looked into that painted face, she saw features so familiar they were impossible to dismiss. But the portrait was only the beginning, because hidden in the history of that house were records of a dead son, a secret relationship, an infant brought to the estate one final time, and documents that could answer the question Nora had spent her entire life avoiding: who was she really? And why had someone worked so hard to leave her outside this family's history? What Nora eventually discovered about the photograph, the man who may have been her father, and the reason her birth was never properly registered would change everything she believed about her mother and could make her the rightful heir to the very house in that $50 photograph. But before we uncover what was waiting inside Bellwether Estate, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Whether you're starting your morning, relaxing in the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you enjoy emotional stories about lost heirs, forgotten family secrets, mysterious inheritances, and ordinary objects that reveal extraordinary truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Now, let's go back to the moment Nora opened a letter from the state of Pennsylvania and discovered that the most basic record of her own life was missing. Nora Hale had filled out the hospital application twice before she reached the line that stopped her. Certified birth certificate. She sat across from the human resources clerk with her folder of identification documents resting on her knees. The new position would mean better hours and enough additional pay that she might finally stop measuring every grocery purchase against rent. "I have my Social Security card and identification," Nora said. The clerk gave her an apologetic look. "We still need the supporting documentation listed here. You can request a certified copy from the state." Nora almost laughed at how ordinary the woman made it sound. She wrote down the information her mother had repeated whenever forms required it. October 1974, Pennsylvania. Elaine Hale had never seemed uncertain about the details. Nora mailed the request that afternoon. She expected the certificate to arrive and thought little about it until the envelope came back. Standing beside the mailboxes outside her apartment, Nora opened it with her thumb. The letter was brief. No matching birth record could be located using the information provided. Nora read it again upstairs, then a third time. She checked the spelling of her name and the date she had submitted. Everything was correct. She called the records office the following morning from the nursing station during her break. The employee asked several questions, searched again, and suggested Nora might have supplied an incorrect county or that her birth had been registered differently. "My mother is dead," Nora said when asked whether a parent could verify the information. The employee's voice softened, but the answer did not change. There was no ordinary record they could certify from what Nora had given them. 5 years had passed since Elaine's death, yet that evening, Nora felt the absence as sharply as she had after the funeral. Her mother had always been able to turn questions aside with a joke or a practical task. They had moved often when Nora was young, and whenever Nora asked why they had no relatives nearby, Elaine said some families were easier loved from a distance. Nora had stopped asking. Now she pulled a cardboard box from the back of her closet. She had carried it through 2 apartments without properly sorting it. Inside were Elaine's scarves, receipts, an old address book, several greeting cards, and photographs Nora already knew. She sat cross-legged on the floor and worked slowly through them. Near the bottom was a small envelope stuck beneath a stack of papers. It contained a single photograph, faded and bent across one corner. Nora did not recognize it. Elaine stood outside a large stone house, holding a bundled infant against her chest. She looked younger than Nora remembered her hair longer, her expression strangely tense. Nora turned the photograph over. 3 faded words had been written across the back. Bellwether, October 1974. Nora stared at the date. The month and year matched the birth information Elaine had always given her. She turned the photograph back over and brought it closer to the lamp. If the baby was Nora, then this picture had been taken when she was an infant. But she had never heard the word Bellwether. There was no address written beneath it, and no name identifying the house. She searched Elaine's address book, then every remaining paper in the box. Nothing. Finally, Nora returned to the photograph. Behind Elaine stood a stone gatepost at the edge of the image. Time had washed most of its surface into gray, but faint marks crossed the stone, too regular to be cracks. They looked almost like carved letters. Nora tilted the photograph toward the light. She could not read them. She looked again at Elaine holding the baby, at the unfamiliar house behind them, then at the state letter lying on the floor beside the box. One document said the beginning of Nora's life could not be found. The other had survived silently among her mother's belongings for 24 years. And for the first time, Nora understood that the damaged photograph in her hands might be the only evidence she possessed of where she had been as a baby. The next afternoon, Nora carried the photograph into a narrow restoration and archival shop 2 blocks from the public library. She had found the place in the telephone directory after calling 3 photography stores that told her they could make copies but could not safely clean an old print. The shop owner, a gray-haired man wearing thin cotton gloves, examined the photograph beneath a bright lamp. "Surface dirt, some fading, crease damage," he said. "Nothing unusual for its age." Nora pointed to the stone gatepost. "Can you tell if those are letters?" He adjusted a magnifying lens. "Possibly. I can clean the print and make an enlarged copy with better contrast." $50. Nora looked at him. 50? "I won't promise the letters become readable." $50 was groceries, part of the electric bill, or several tanks of gas. Spending it on a photograph from a place she had never heard of felt irresponsible. She nearly put the picture back into its envelope. Then she remembered the state letter and no matching birth record. Do it. 2 days later, Nora returned after work. The original photograph looked only slightly different, but the enlargement beside it revealed details she had never noticed. Mortar lines separated the stones of the house. A narrow window appeared behind Elaine's shoulder. Most importantly, the gatepost was no longer a gray blur. Nora leaned over it. 7 carved letters crossed the stone. Bellwether. She released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The $50 had purchased one word. "Is that enough to find a place?" she asked. "If Bellwether is the property name, maybe. Try local history records." Nora took the enlargement directly to the library. The current county directory gave her nothing useful. Neither did the first property reference book she checked. She searched older regional histories, then newspaper indexes. Bellwether appeared as a surname several times, but she could not tell whether any reference belonged to the house. After nearly an hour, she found an old article containing a small photograph of a stone residence outside Ashford. The image was grainy, but the front windows and steep roofline matched the building behind Elaine. The caption identified it as Bellwether Estate. Nora copied the location and searched recent newspaper records. This time she found a short obituary. Margaret Bellwether, 81, longtime resident of Ashford, had died weeks earlier. A second notice concerned probate administration of her estate. Nora read both twice. Margaret's obituary mentioned no children. The probate notice listed an attorney, Daniel Mercer. Nora sat back from the library machine. She had expected the name on the gatepost to lead to an abandoned building, perhaps a family that had moved away decades ago. Instead, the woman who had owned the property had been alive until only weeks before Nora began looking. The timing made her uncomfortable, as if her search could be mistaken for something it was not. She wanted a birth record, not a dead stranger's property. Still, her mother had stood outside that house with an infant in October 1974. Someone had taken the photograph. Someone had written Bellwether on the back. Nora copied Daniel Mercer's telephone number. At home that evening, she placed the restored photograph beside the state letter on her kitchen table and stared at the telephone. She thought of Elaine's habit of changing subjects whenever Nora asked about relatives. Maybe there had been a simple explanation. A job, a friend, a rented room. Yet if Bellwether meant nothing, why had Elaine kept this one photograph hidden beneath papers for 24 years? Nora dialed before she could change her mind. A receptionist answered, then transferred her after Nora said she was calling about Bellwether Estate, Daniel Mercer. His voice was formal. Nora tightened her grip on the receiver. "My name is Nora Hale. I don't know whether this has anything to do with the estate proceedings. I'm trying to find information about my birth." Silence followed. Nora continued. "My mother died 5 years ago. I recently found an old photograph of her holding me as a baby outside Bellwether Estate. It says October 1974 on the back. You're certain the property is Bellwether? I paid to have the photograph restored. The name is carved into the gatepost. I found an older picture of the house, too. It matches." Mercer did not answer immediately. Nora wondered if he thought she was inventing the story. "I'm not calling to claim anything," she said. "I just need to know why my mother was there." "You said your surname is Hale?" "Yes." "And your mother Elaine?" The silence on the other end changed. It was no longer the pause of a lawyer choosing careful words. "What was her full name?" Mercer asked. Nora looked down at the photograph. Elaine Marie Hale. This time, Daniel Mercer said nothing at all. Daniel Mercer asked Nora to bring the original photograph and the restored enlargement to his office the following afternoon. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps early 30s. With a careful manner that made every question sound deliberate. He examined both photographs without touching the original until Nora slid its envelope toward him. "Why did you go quiet when I gave you my mother's name?" she asked. "Because I thought I had seen Hale somewhere in the estate materials. I wasn't certain where. I'd rather verify that before telling you something inaccurate." Nora disliked the answer, but understood it. Daniel placed the enlargement beside an old property photograph from his file. The roofline, windows, and gatepost matched. "This is Bellwether Estate. So my mother was there." "Yes, the photograph establishes that much." "And nothing else?" "Not legally." Nora leaned back. "I told you yesterday, I'm not trying to inherit anything." "I believe that. But Margaret Bellwether died without an acknowledged child or grandchild. Probate is active, and her nephew Thomas Bellwether is presently the expected beneficiary. If someone appears claiming an unknown family connection, I have to treat it carefully. I'm claiming I don't have a birth certificate." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "Then we start with what can be proved." He offered to take Nora to the estate and compare the photograph directly with the property. An hour later, they turned from the county road outside Ashford onto a long drive bordered by bare trees. Nora recognized the house before the car stopped. Age had darkened the stone, and vines covered part of one wall. But the narrow window behind Elaine in the photograph was there. So was the gatepost. Nora walked toward it slowly and touched the carved letters. Bellwether, 24 years earlier. Elaine had stood within a few feet of the same stone, holding her. Nora tried to imagine her mother young and frightened, carrying a baby toward that house. The image refused to connect with the woman who had packed school lunches, worked long hours, and dismissed questions about family with practiced ease. "You all right?" Daniel asked. "I've spent my whole life thinking there was nothing to find." Before he could answer, the front door opened. A broad-shouldered man stepped onto the porch. Daniel introduced him as Thomas Bellwether. Thomas looked at Nora, then at the photograph in her hand. "This is the woman you mentioned, Nora Hale," Daniel said. "She's trying to establish why her mother visited the property in 1974. Thomas frowned. "And that concerns probate? We don't know yet. It shouldn't. Margaret had no grandchildren." Nora felt heat rise into her face. "I didn't say she did. People don't usually arrive after a death carrying old photographs for no reason. My reason is that the state can't find my birth record." Thomas glanced at Daniel. "A photograph won't fix that, I know." Daniel interrupted before Nora answered. "We're here to verify information, nothing more." Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish. Daniel led them to a small study where boxes from Margaret's papers had been inventoried. He located an old household ledger after several minutes of searching. Pages listed deliveries, repairs, workers, and occasional visitors. October 1974. Nora said. Daniel turned carefully through the month. His finger stopped halfway down a page. Nora leaned closer. Written in faded blue ink was a date, followed by 2 words. Elaine Hale. Nora's throat tightened. The photograph had placed Elaine outside the house. The ledger placed her inside its history. "Who wrote this?" Nora asked. "Probably someone managing the household," Daniel said. Thomas looked over his shoulder. "It still doesn't prove who she was. I didn't ask what it proved." Nora stared at her mother's name. Elaine had known these people well enough for someone to record her arrival, yet she had erased Bellwether from every story she later told her daughter. Daniel closed the ledger gently. "We should look through the remaining records before drawing conclusions." Nora stepped away, suddenly needing space. She walked into the adjoining hall, while Daniel and Thomas continued speaking behind her. The walls were crowded with landscapes and formal family portraits. She barely noticed them until she reached the staircase. Then she stopped. A large portrait hung above a narrow table. It showed a young woman in an old-fashioned dark dress, seated with one hand resting against a book. Nora moved closer. The woman had a narrow chin, high cheekbones, and unusually shaped eyes that tilted slightly at the outer corners. Nora knew those eyes. She saw them every morning in the mirror. Even the uneven curve of the upper lip was familiar. Daniel entered the hall and found Nora staring upward. "Who is she?" Nora asked. He followed her gaze. "I'll have to check the family inventory." "How old was she there?" Daniel studied the brass plate beneath the frame. 24. Nora felt something cold move through her. She was 24. Thomas appeared behind Daniel and went silent when he saw where Nora was looking. Nora turned toward them, then back to the painted face. The photograph had brought her to Bellwether Estate, and the visitor ledger had confirmed her mother had been there, but neither prepared her for the impossible familiarity of the woman on the wall. A woman painted decades before Nora was born was looking back at her with Nora's own face. Daniel checked the brass plate beneath the portrait again, then crossed to a narrow cabinet where the estate inventory had been placed. Nora stayed beneath the painting. The longer she looked, the less comfortable the resemblance became. It was not simply dark hair or a similar face shape. The woman's eyes, the slight asymmetry of her mouth, even the angle of her brows felt disturbingly familiar. Daniel returned with a typed inventory sheet. "Eleanor Bellwether," he said. "Samuel Bellwether's grandmother. The portrait was painted when she was 24. Samuel," Nora asked. "Margaret's son." Thomas answered before Daniel could. "Her only son." Nora turned toward him. "Where is he?" Thomas's expression tightened. "Dead." Daniel glanced at the inventory. Samuel Bellwether died in 1974. The year landed harder than Nora expected. What month? I don't have that here. Thomas folded his arms. "This is exactly what I meant. You're looking at a portrait and making connections that may not exist." "I haven't made any connection," Nora said. "You're the one worried about one." Daniel stepped between the tension before it sharpened. "Physical resemblance can be interesting, but it isn't evidence of inheritance by itself." Nora looked back at Eleanor. "I know. We need records. Then find records." The words came out harsher than she intended. Daniel did not react. They returned to the study and spent the next hour reviewing boxes already cataloged from Margaret's papers. Nora found household bills, church correspondence, old tax notices, holiday cards, and decades of ordinary family clutter. Samuel's name appeared frequently before 1974 and almost disappeared afterward. There were school records, a few photographs from his teenage years, and receipts from a mechanic. Nothing explained Elaine. Nora finally pushed back from the table. "There should be something from the year he died." Daniel nodded. "There are gaps." "Convenient gaps," Thomas said. "My aunt was 81 when she died." "Old papers disappear." Nora looked at him. "My entire birth record disappeared." "That doesn't mean Margaret had anything to do with it." "I didn't say she did." "You keep saying that while going through her house." Nora stood. "I came here because my mother stood outside this house holding me when I was an infant. Your family's ledger has her name in it. A man in this family died the same year, and a portrait upstairs looks enough like me that even you stopped talking when you saw it. I'm allowed to ask questions." Thomas's jaw tightened, but Daniel cut in. "And questions are what we're dealing with. Nothing has been established beyond Elaine Hale's presence here." Nora hated hearing her mother reduced to a confirmed visit, but she knew Daniel was right. Facts had become important in a way they never had before. After Thomas left the room, Daniel continued through an old payroll ledger. There may be another way to learn who was here in 1974. Nora leaned closer. Several names repeated month after month: groundskeepers, a cook, a driver, and one housekeeper employed for years, Ruth Calder. Daniel said, "She appears through the late 60s and most of the 70s. Still alive? Possibly." He copied the name. By evening, they found a current telephone listing in Ashford for a Ruth Calder. Nora wanted to call immediately. Daniel suggested she do it herself. If she remembers your mother, she may respond differently to you than to an attorney. Nora dialed from Daniel's office before she could reconsider. An older woman answered on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Calder?" "Yes." "My name is Nora Hale. I'm trying to learn something about Bellwether Estate." Silence. Nora continued carefully. "I found your name in old household records. My mother visited there in October 1974. Who was your mother?" Nora gripped the receiver. "Elaine Hale." The silence on the other end became complete. Nora felt the same strange shift she had heard when Daniel first learned Elaine's name. "Mrs. Calder, where did you get this number?" "A directory." "Why are you asking about Elaine?" "Because she's dead. And I don't have anyone else to ask." Ruth exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry to hear that." Nora's pulse quickened. "You knew her?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Daniel remained silent across the desk. Nora lowered her voice. "Please. The state can't find my birth certificate. I found a photograph of my mother holding me outside Bellwether. I just need to know why we were there." Ruth did not answer for several seconds. "Some things were meant to stay private." "Private for whom? Everyone who knew is either dead or refusing to speak." "I'm the person who has to live without knowing where I came from." Ruth's voice weakened. "I made a promise a long time ago." "To my mother?" Another silence. "Mrs. Calder, did you know me?" Nora asked. The older woman drew in a breath. "I can't discuss this over the telephone." "Then let me come see you." "No." Why Ruth hesitated so long, Nora thought the call had disconnected. Then she spoke, almost in a whisper. "Because your mother should never have brought you back to that house." Ruth Calder called Nora the next morning. "I shouldn't have ended the conversation the way I did," she said. "If you still want answers, you can come by this afternoon." Nora wrote down the address with a hand that felt less steady than she wanted. Ruth lived in a small brick house near the edge of Ashford. When Nora arrived, the older woman opened the door before she could knock twice. Ruth was thin, silver-haired, and watched Nora with an expression that changed the moment their eyes met. "You look like them," she said quietly. Nora did not ask who she meant. "Inside." Ruth poured coffee neither of them touched. For several minutes she asked ordinary questions about Nora's work and where she lived. Nora finally placed the restored photograph on the table. "You know this picture?" Ruth looked down at it and closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." "Then please tell me about my mother." Ruth folded her hands. "Elaine came to Ashford when she was young. She worked for a doctor for a while. That was how she met Samuel Bellwether." Nora felt her chest tighten at the name. Margaret's son, her only son. And Margaret did not approve. Why? Because Elaine was not from the right family, according to Margaret. She had no money, no connections, and no patience for being treated like she should be grateful just to enter Bellwether House, despite herself. Nora could almost hear Elaine answering back. "Were they serious?" "Very." Ruth's voice softened. "Samuel intended to marry her." Nora looked down at the photograph. "Did my mother love him?" "Yes." The certainty hurt more than Nora expected. Elaine had spent 19 years raising her and had never once spoken Samuel's name. "What happened?" Ruth hesitated. Margaret pushed Samuel to end the relationship. He refused. There were arguments, terrible ones, and then Elaine became pregnant. Nora went still. Ruth looked away. I knew before most people did. She was frightened, but she was not ashamed. Nora forced herself to ask, "Was Samuel the father?" Ruth's eyes returned to hers. "There are things I promised your mother I would never discuss." Nora stood abruptly. "You invited me here to tell me she loved Samuel Bellwether, that she was pregnant, and then stop. I'm trying to keep a promise. She's dead." That doesn't make promises meaningless. It does when the person living with the consequences never agreed to them. Ruth flinched. Nora immediately regretted the sharpness, but did not apologize. "I don't even have a normal birth record," she said. "I found out my mother had an entire life she erased from mine. I need more than hints." Ruth's expression tightened with sadness. "Elaine believed silence would protect you." "From what?" "From this family. From what happened here." "That isn't an answer." Ruth shook her head slowly. "Not today." Nora sat again because anger had begun to give way to exhaustion. "Then give me something I can actually follow." Ruth considered this. Samuel kept his personal papers separate from Margaret's. Letters, legal documents, things he didn't want her reading. Where in a walnut writing box, dark wood, brass corners, he kept it in his room. "Is it still at Bellwether?" "I don't know. After Samuel died, Margaret packed away many of his things." Nora absorbed the word "died," even though she already knew it. "You worked there then?" "Yes." "So you were there in October 1974. Ruth looked at the photograph again. "Yes. When my mother came with a baby," another pause. Nora pushed the enlargement closer. "Mrs. Calder, who took this picture." Ruth's hand moved toward the edge of the photograph, but stopped before touching it. Her face changed, as though the room had become 24 years younger. "Elaine was standing near the gate," she said. "She asked me to hold the camera." Nora barely breathed. "You took it?" Ruth nodded. "I did." "You saw the baby?" Ruth looked directly at her. "Yes." "Was it me?" Ruth's eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, Nora. I took that photograph of your mother holding you outside Bellwether Estate in October 1974. Nora kept looking at Ruth as if the older woman had handed her a piece of her own memory. "Why did she bring me there?" Ruth lowered her eyes to the photograph. Samuel was already dead. Elaine had stayed away through the worst of the fighting, but after he died, she came back once. She wanted Margaret to acknowledge you as Samuel's daughter. Ruth hesitated. "That was what Elaine asked of her." Nora's pulse quickened. "And Margaret refused." The answer was so simple that it felt crueler than an explanation. Ruth remembered Elaine arriving with Nora wrapped against the October cold. She had asked to speak privately with Margaret. Ruth did not hear every word, but she heard enough Elaine insisting the child deserved recognition. Margaret saying grief did not change what she believed about the relationship. Elaine came outside crying. Ruth said, "She almost never cried where anyone could see." "Then you took the photograph before she left. She asked me to. I never understood why." Nora looked at her mother's young face differently now. She had thought the tension in Elaine's expression might be fear. Perhaps it had been the moment after rejection. What happened next? She left Pennsylvania not long afterward. Before she went, she asked me not to tell the Bellwethers where she had gone. "And you agreed?" "Yes." Anger moved through Nora unexpectedly. She decided I would never know any of this. She thought she was protecting you. Everyone keeps calling silence protection. Ruth accepted the rebuke without defending Elaine. Your mother was hurt and frightened. That doesn't mean every choice she made was right. That answer softened something Nora had been holding rigid. She could imagine Elaine wanting to close a door forever. She could not yet forgive her for locking Nora on the other side of it. That afternoon, Nora met Daniel at Bellwether Estate. When she told him about Samuel's walnut writing box, he checked the inventory. No item was listed under that description. They began with stored belongings from Samuel's old rooms. Thomas arrived midway through the search and immediately objected. She still hasn't proved she belongs to this family. Daniel closed the box he was examining. I'm inventorying estate property. That is within my authority. With her, she identified an item described by a former employee. Thomas looked at Nora. And if every stranger with a story gets to search family possessions, Nora resisted answering. Daniel did it for her. Then I determine whether the story has evidence. That's my job. The search lasted hours. They opened cartons of books, clothing, receipts, old photographs, and desk supplies. Dust coated Nora's fingers. Twice she thought they had found the box only to uncover ordinary wooden cases. Near evening, Daniel pulled a blanket from a storage chest and exposed dark walnut beneath it. Brass corners caught the light. Nora's exhaustion disappeared. That's it. The box was locked, but a small key had been taped beneath its base. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded cord. Most were written in Samuel's hand and addressed to Margaret. Daniel read dates while Nora carefully unfolded pages. The arguments Ruth described were there in fragments. Samuel accused his mother of treating Elaine as though family standing mattered more than character. Margaret's replies were absent. Then Nora found a letter dated in 1974. One sentence stopped her. Whatever you believe about Elaine, my daughter has done nothing to deserve your anger. Nora read it twice. My daughter. Daniel leaned closer but did not take the paper. That language matters. He doesn't name her. No. They searched the remaining letters. Samuel referred again to my daughter, but none of the visible pages connected that child directly to Nora. Thomas, standing across the room, said quietly, Samuel could have meant anyone. Nora wanted to argue, but Daniel's expression told her the same thing. Possibility was not proof. She returned to the first bundle and found one final folded letter near the bottom. The handwriting was hurried. Samuel wrote about paperwork, responsibility, and Margaret's refusal to accept what he had already decided. Nora reached the last paragraph and stopped. Her hands began to tremble. Daniel. He came beside her. Nora read the sentence aloud. I signed what the doctor asked. Nora will never have to wonder whether I claimed her. Daniel made a copy of Samuel's letter before Nora left Bellwether that evening. By the next morning, he had begun calling county offices, old medical associations, and anyone who might know what a doctor in 1974 would have asked an unmarried father to sign. We need the document, not Samuel's memory of signing it, he told Nora. His letter helps us know what to search for. Their first useful lead came from Ruth when Nora asked whether Elaine had given birth in Ashford. Ruth remembered a small private maternity home several miles outside town. It had served women who wanted more privacy than the county hospital offered. Daniel found that the facility had closed years earlier. Its medical files had been dispersed, but some administrative records had been donated to a local historical archive. 2 days later, Nora sat beside Daniel in a cramped archive room while an attendant brought them boxes containing old ledgers. The first contained expenses. The second listed staff. The third was a patient register. Nora turned pages carefully until she reached October 1974. Her finger stopped. Elaine Hale. For several seconds, she could not read anything else. Then she followed the entry across the page. A baby girl was recorded beneath Elaine's name, Nora. The father or contact column contained another name, Samuel Bellwether. Nora sat back. She had spent 24 years carrying only her mother's surname, and now both parents existed together in faded ink on a line written when she was born.
"This is me," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "It's strong, corroborating evidence. You always make everything sound smaller. Because I don't want you hurt by assuming one record proves more than it does." Nora looked again at Samuel's name. "It proves something to me." The ledger included a physician's initials and a notation indicating delayed paperwork.
Daniel traced the maternity home's procedures through other archived material. Birth information had normally been forwarded for county registration, but several entries from the facility's final years contained incomplete filing marks. Nora's had none. Could that be why the state found nothing she asked? Possibly. If the paperwork was prepared but never properly filed, the state would have nothing in the ordinary index. It was an explanation, but not yet the document Samuel had described. Daniel contacted the county records office again using the physician's name and maternity home information. An employee searched older holdings and found no registered certificate under Nora Hale or Bellwether. Another afternoon disappeared into boxes. Nora had begun missing hours at work and could not afford many more.
"I spent $50 because I thought a photograph might tell me where I was," she said as they left the archive. "Now I'm losing wages to search for paperwork someone should have filed 24 years ago." Daniel glanced at her. "We can slow down." Nora shook her head. "I've waited 24 years without knowing I was waiting." The following morning, Daniel called before her shift. "The archive inventory has another entry we overlooked." Nora met him after work. He showed her a transfer sheet from when the maternity home closed. Among ordinary administrative materials was a description of miscellaneous physician certificates and unfiled vital record forms.
The box number led them to a storage section that had never been fully cataloged. The attendant warned that the packet might contain nothing relevant. Inside were brittle forms grouped without alphabetical order. Daniel searched from one end, while Nora searched from the other. She found 3 birth forms from 1973, then several from 1975. Her hope began to collapse. Halfway through a thin packet, she saw Elaine's name. Daniel. He moved beside her. Nora laid the page flat. It was an original physician birth certificate from the private maternity home. Her own name appeared as Nora Hale. The date matched what Elaine had always told her. Elaine Marie Hale was listed as mother. Nora's eyes moved to the line beneath it. Father Samuel Bellwether. She pressed her fingertips against the table because her hands had started shaking. Why wasn't this filed? "We'll need to verify the chain of records," Daniel said, studying the form. "But the notation suggests it remained with the maternity home instead of reaching final county registration." Nora barely heard him. For years, she had believed there was simply nothing behind Elaine's silence. Then she had feared perhaps even Elaine had lied about the beginning of her life. But here was the date Elaine had given her, her own name, and the name of the man whose letter said he had claimed her. Daniel pointed carefully toward the physician's signature and the identifying information on the form. "Nora, this is much stronger than the ledger." She looked at him. Strong enough that we keep going." Nora lowered her eyes once more to the certificate that should have entered the public record 24 years earlier. The state had told her no matching birth certificate existed, yet all this time, the original had survived in an uncatalogued packet, and on it, Samuel Bellwether was named as her father. Daniel spent the next several days verifying the physician certificate against the maternity home ledger, the doctor's surviving records, and the county transfer inventory. Nothing contradicted it. Still, when Nora asked whether Samuel's name on the certificate settled everything, Daniel remained cautious. "It establishes the circumstances of your birth," he said. "But Samuel wrote that he signed something. If a separate acknowledgement exists, I want it." They returned to Bellwether and searched the walnut writing box again. Nora removed every letter, envelope, and loose sheet. Nothing remained. Maybe Margaret destroyed it, she said. The thought hurt differently now. Samuel had written that Nora would never wonder whether he claimed her, yet she had spent her life doing exactly that without even knowing his name. Daniel lifted the empty box and examined its interior. This bottom is thicker than it should be. The lining near one corner had worn away, exposing a narrow seam. He pressed gently along it, and a shallow wooden panel shifted upward. Beneath it lay several folded papers. There was nothing dramatic about the compartment. It had simply been concealed by the box's construction and overlooked for decades. Daniel opened the first document. His expression changed. Nora. She moved beside him. The paper was a notarized acknowledgment signed by Samuel Bellwether. Nora read her own name before anything else. Samuel declared himself the biological father of Nora, infant daughter of Elaine Marie Hale, and accepted paternity. His signature matched the letters. A notary's seal and date appeared below it. Nora touched the edge of the page. He did it. Yes. He knew, Daniel nodded. He knew, and he put it in writing. The other papers included copies of letters Samuel had sent Margaret. They were more direct than those already found. He asked his mother to recognize Nora as his daughter and warned that refusing Elaine would not make the child cease to be family. Nora had expected vindication to feel triumphant. Instead, she sat down because her legs felt weak. All my life, I assumed if there was a father somewhere, he chose not to be there. Daniel remained quiet. He died, Nora said. He didn't leave me. For the first time since entering Bellwether, grief came without anger. She had never known Samuel, yet she mourned the possibility that had been taken from both of them. Later, while Daniel cataloged the documents, Nora searched Margaret's more recent correspondence. She found several letters written years after Samuel's death to former acquaintances and old contacts. They asked, cautiously at first, whether anyone knew where Elaine Hale had gone. Later letters were less guarded. Margaret wrote that she wished to locate Elaine and the child. None contained a successful address. Nora carried them to Daniel. She looked for us. Apparently, after refusing us, both things can be true. Nora disliked that truth because it offered neither clean forgiveness nor clean hatred. Margaret had rejected Elaine and her infant granddaughter when they stood at her door. Years later, she had regretted it. Regret did not return Samuel, repair Nora's missing records, or give Elaine back the years she spent hiding from the Bellwethers. But it meant Margaret's refusal had not remained easy forever. Thomas arrived while Daniel was copying the acknowledgment. He read enough to understand what it was. Samuel signed this. It appears properly executed, Daniel said. Thomas looked at Nora, his defensiveness giving way to something less certain. Margaret never told me. She didn't tell me either, Nora said. Daniel gathered the certificate, acknowledgement, ledger copies, letters, and visitor record into separate files. I need to review the probate implications formally. Nora looked at him. Meaning we now have evidence connecting you to Elaine. Connecting Elaine to Bellwether, documenting your birth, naming Samuel as your father, and showing Samuel separately acknowledged you as his daughter. So I can finally get my birth record corrected. We have a strong basis to pursue that. He paused. But there is another consequence. Nora knew what he meant before he said it. She looked around the study, at the shelves and old furniture belonging to a family she had not known existed weeks earlier. I told you I didn't come here for Margaret's property. I know. But probate does not depend on why you started looking.
Daniel rested his hand on the file containing Samuel's acknowledgement. Margaret died without an acknowledged living child or grandchild because no one handling the estate knew you existed. If these documents establish you as Samuel Bellwether's legally recognized daughter, that changes the inheritance question. Nora thought of the $50 photograph on her kitchen table. The object that had led her here only because she wanted proof of where she had been born. How much does it change? Daniel met her eyes. Enough that you may not simply have found the family you lost. Nora, you may be the legal heir to Bellwether Estate. Daniel assembled Nora's evidence in the order another lawyer could challenge it. First came the maternity home ledger naming Elaine Hale, infant Nora, and Samuel Bellwether. Then the original physician certificate, the notarized acknowledgement of paternity, Samuel's letters, Bellwether's October 1974 visitor ledger, and Ruth Calder's written statement confirming Elaine had brought infant Nora to the estate. A portrait that looks like you is memorable, Daniel said. But this is what proves a relationship. Nora looked at the stack. Her entire missing history occupied less than an inch of paper. Thomas challenged the claim through the probate proceedings, as Daniel had expected. He did not accuse Nora of forging anything, but questioned whether documents overlooked for 24 years should displace the inheritance everyone had assumed would pass to him. At a meeting before the formal determination, Thomas sat across from Nora with his own attorney while Daniel explained how each record supported the next. The state couldn't even locate her birth certificate, Thomas said, because the physician certificate was never completed through ordinary registration. Daniel replied, its custody is documented through the maternity home's transferred records. The ledger independently records the same birth. Thomas pointed toward Samuel's acknowledgement. And that notarized in 1974. Samuel identifies Nora by name and Elaine as her mother. Margarita never acknowledged a granddaughter. Nora finally spoke. Samuel acknowledged his daughter. Thomas looked at her. You understand what happens if this is accepted? Yes. I was told for years the estate would eventually come to me. I was told nothing. Nora said. The room went quiet. She had not meant the words as a weapon, but Thomas looked away. He could offer no document contradicting Samuel's paternity. Afterward, Nora told Daniel she felt sick. I wanted a birth certificate. Now it looks like I waited until Margaret died to take her house. The timing of your discovery doesn't change who your father was. It changes how this feels. That evening she visited Ruth. The older woman listened as Nora described the hearing. Maybe Thomas should have it. Nora said, Margaret knew him. She didn't know me. Ruth shook her head. Margaret knew about you. Knowing I existed isn't the same as wanting me. No. Ruth did not soften it. She refused you when your mother brought you there. That was real. Nora stared into her untouched coffee. Then why should I inherit anything from her? That isn't a question I can answer for you. But don't confuse what Margaret did with what Samuel did. Nora looked up. Ruth continued. Your father claimed you. He wanted his mother to recognize you. Margaret's refusal kept you outside the family, but it didn't make you less his daughter. Ruth told her Margaret changed in later years, after Samuel's death. Pride had slowly become regret. She asked after Elaine more than once, and eventually tried to find her. Did she ever say she was sorry? Nora asked. Yes. To my mother? No. To me? No. Ruth's face saddened. That is the tragedy of regret kept private. The people you hurt received none of it. Nora understood then that she did not have to transform Margaret into a loving grandmother simply because the woman eventually regretted her cruelty. Margaret had failed them. Her later remorse explained something, but erased nothing. More importantly,
Nora no longer needed Margaret's approval to validate what Samuel had already written plainly in 1974. The probate determination came several days later. Daniel asked Nora to meet him at Bellwether rather than discuss it by telephone. Thomas was there when she arrived, standing near the study window. His expression told her before Daniel opened the file. Daniel read the essential finding carefully. The documentary evidence established Nora as the daughter of Samuel Bellwether, Samuel's acknowledgement, supported by the physician certificate, maternity ledger, correspondence, and Ruth's testimony, established the relationship sufficiently for the estate proceeding. As Samuel's daughter, Nora held the superior claim to Margaret Bellwether's small estate. Thomas exhaled and stared outside. Nora felt no victory over him. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked back. "You didn't create the records." It was not warmth, but it was the first thing he had said to her that carried no accusation. After Thomas left, Nora remained in the hall beneath Eleanor Bellwether's portrait. Weeks earlier, she had stood there feeling like an intruder who happened to share a dead woman's face. Now the law had given a name to the connection the portrait could only suggest. Daniel approached holding something small. "There will still be administrative work," he said, "but the determination is entered." He opened his hand. A ring of old keys rested in his palm. Nora recognized one from Daniel unlocking the front door on her first visit. She did not reach for them immediately. "These are mine. Bellwether is yours now." Nora finally extended her hand. The keys dropped into her palm, unexpectedly heavy. She closed her fingers around them and looked toward the stone house that had once refused entry to her mother and infant self. 24 years later, Nora Hale stood inside it as Samuel Bellwether's recognized daughter and the legal heir to Bellwether Estate. Nora returned to Bellwether Estate alone the following morning. For the first time, she did not wait for Daniel to unlock the door. One of the old keys turned stiffly, and she had to push her shoulder against the wood before it opened. The house was legally hers now, but ownership immediately felt less romantic than the word inheritance suggested. A section of gutter had pulled away from the roof. 2 upstairs windows needed repair. Daniel's inventory showed modest savings, not enough to transform the aging property into something grand. Bellwether was a small estate with 14 acres, an old house, family possessions, and expenses that would begin whether Nora was ready or not. She spent the morning reviewing Margaret's remaining personal papers. In a drawer beneath correspondence Daniel had already cataloged, Nora found an envelope marked with Samuel's name. Inside were copies of his letters and the acknowledgement of paternity they had already discovered in the walnut box. Margaret had kept her own copies. Beneath them was a photographic sleeve containing a negative. Nora held it toward the window, even reversed and tiny. She recognized the stone gate and the shape of Elaine holding a baby. It was the companion negative from October 1974. Margaret had kept evidence of that day for 24 years. Nora sat at the desk and arranged everything in order. The story no longer required guesses. Elaine had given birth at the private maternity home outside Ashford. The physician prepared paperwork, but the certificate never completed ordinary county registration. Samuel knew Nora was his child. He signed a notarized acknowledgement and wrote Margaret demanding that she recognize his daughter. Then Samuel died before he could marry Elaine or ensure the registration was completed. After his death, Elaine returned to Bellwether with infant Nora. Ruth photographed them near the gate. Elaine asked Margaret to acknowledge her granddaughter. Margaret refused. Hurt and frightened, Elaine left Pennsylvania and raised Nora under the name Hale, keeping Bellwether out of their life. Years later, Margaret regretted what she had done. She searched for Elaine, preserved Samuel's documents, and kept the negative from that final visit. But regret had come without repair. Nora touched Elaine's face in the restored photograph. She understood her mother better now. Elaine had lost Samuel, been rejected by his family, and chosen silence because she believed distance would protect her child. Understanding did not make Nora grateful for 24 years without the truth. She wished Elaine had trusted her with it. She also understood Margaret without forgiving her. Margaret's pride had cost other people years she could never return. Keeping papers was not the same as opening the door when Elaine stood outside it. Later that week, Thomas came to collect several personal items Daniel had confirmed were his. The conversation was brief. "I suppose you'll sell," he said. Nora looked around the hall. "I haven't decided permanently." Thomas nodded toward Eleanor's portrait. "Margaret used to say I had none of the bellwether face." Nora almost smiled. "Apparently I got too much of it." Thomas gave a small, reluctant laugh. There was no sudden embrace and no promise to become family. But when he left, he said, "Take care of the place." "I'll try." That was enough. Nora chose not to sell immediately. The savings could cover the most urgent roof and window repairs if she was careful. But she would keep working. Bellwether was not a fortune that freed her from ordinary life. It was a responsibility she had inherited along with the answers. Daniel also helped her use the physician certificate, maternity ledger, and legal determination to begin correcting her official birth documentation. When the paperwork was finally accepted, Nora stared at the certified record longer than she expected. The missing document that had threatened her hospital opportunity now had an explanation, and the facts of her birth no longer existed only in her mother's memory. One afternoon, she carried the restored $50 photograph back to Bellwether. She stopped beneath Eleanor Bellwether's portrait. At 24, Eleanor had possessed the same tilted eyes, narrow chin, and uneven curve of the mouth Nora saw in mirrors weeks earlier. That resemblance had seemed almost impossible. Now Nora knew it had never been proof. Faces could suggest, families could deny, memory could fail. What established the truth were the surviving records, Elaine's entry in the maternity ledger, the physician's certificate, Samuel's notarized acknowledgement, his letters, Ruth's testimony, and the visitor ledger recording Elaine's final return to Bellwether. Still, none of those documents would have been found without the photograph. Nora had nearly refused to spend $50 restoring it because $50 mattered to her. That small decision had revealed one carved word on a gatepost, and that word had led her here. She placed the photograph beside Samuel's letters in a protective sleeve rather than returning it to the bottom of a forgotten box. In the glass covering Eleanor's portrait, Nora could see 3 generations at once, the painted Bellwether woman. Elaine holding her infant daughter in the photograph, and Nora's own reflection standing between them. For most of her life, she had assumed there was nothing behind her mother's silence. Then the state failed to find her birth certificate, and for a frightening moment, even the beginning of her own story seemed uncertain. Now she knew differently. Samuel had claimed her. Elaine had protected her imperfectly but fiercely. Margaret had rejected her and later regretted it too late. Bellwether Estate could give Nora property, records, and a family name, but it could not decide who she was. Nora had built 24 years of life before any court recognized her as Samuel Bellwether's daughter. She had entered this house searching for a document that proved she existed. Standing beneath the portrait with the $50 photograph in her hand, Nora finally understood that she had always existed beyond anyone's willingness to acknowledge her.